Hello and welcome to Chipping Norton in the heart of the Cotswolds. Now in this video we're going to talk about a particular building that was here, and still is here actually, that became very famous around the world for being a recording studio. Now the town of Chipping Norton itself centres around the market square, which we're sort of looking at the moment. It is mostly a car park, but on certain days it becomes a market, and the town is very much centred around it, and most of the shops are built around it, and it's all in this yellow stone, which is of course synonymous with this area. Of particular note is this wonderful building, which is the town hall, which, although it's looking a bit weathered these days, it stood the test of time pretty well, and it's still very pretty and very impressive, I think. Now the building that I'm going to talk about is this one, which was the world famous Chipping Norton Studios from the early 1970s until around 1999 when it finally closed down. It was responsible for producing quite a lot of music in its time, and here's a few examples. Now the first one is the Bay City Rollers, who recorded their hit single Bye Bye Baby in 1974. And then zipping forward to 1986, Status Quo recorded In the Army Now. Both the album and the single were recorded here, but not all of the album actually, only part of it. But the single that became the big hit from it was also one of the songs recorded here. There's also Pete Wingfield, who most people will not necessarily know instantly by name, but he was a lyricist mainly and a musician. And he recorded his song 18 with a Bullet and the rest of this particular album called Breakfast Special here in 1974. He's also responsible for writing the lyrics to a Christmas song, I Believe in Father Christmas, by Greg Lake. Also in the early 1990s, Radiohead recorded most of their debut album here, including their debut hit single Creep, which eventually, after a bit of a false start, did chart and did very well and got them some attention, and then their career went off into the stratosphere a couple of years later. Also in the late 1980s, Fairground Attraction, which featured singer Eddie Reader, recorded their debut album here. Now strangely, I've just found out that they've got back together after nearly 40 years and they're recording a second album. I think they may have actually just recorded it and they've just released a single actually. So a bit of a gap there. Not many artists wait that long between albums, but they've managed to do it somehow. Also, the Dutch band Focus recorded some tracks here in the early 1970s. Another hit single from the 80s is Cutting Crew's I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight, which was also recorded here. In the early 1980s, Duran Duran recorded their debut album. I think it would have been around 1980 when they actually recorded some of the tracks here. They didn't record everything, but some key tracks were recorded in the studio here, and the album finally saw the light of day in early 1981. Also related to Duran Duran is the single Too Shy by Kajagoogoo, which was recorded here in 1983. This was of course produced by Nick Rhodes, the keyboard player in Duran Duran. Also in 1989-1990, Beverly Craven worked on a few tracks here for her debut album, including the breakthrough hit single Promise Me. Beverly's a very brave person. She's fought and survived breast cancer twice, and she was also pretty brave at the start of her career because initially she was paired up with well-known record producer Stuart Levine, who was famous for recording lots of hits and early albums for Simply Red. And after a few weeks of working with him, the songs that finally came out that she heard were not to her liking, shall we say. And she thought they sounded too much like Simply Red, and she wanted to have her own individual style. So she went to her bosses at the record company and told them this and said that she wanted to scrap everything and start again. They were probably horrified, and having spent so much money recording all this stuff already. But when they listened to what had been recorded, they actually agreed with her, and they thought that she was doing the right thing. So she started all over again, and then, of course, the rest is history. And in 1991, XTC recorded what would eventually turn out to be their last album for a major record label called Nonsuch. The band weren't very impressed with their record company, particularly at this point, because it seemed like they were doing their level best to not promote the record. There seemed to be some kind of standoff going on between the band and their record company, and relations were somewhat frosty, shall we say, at times. In the end, it led to the band taking the rather unusual move of effectively going on strike and refusing to record for them to fulfill the rest of their contracts until the issues they had been resolved. Eventually, it did get sorted, but it took another 6 years or so before things really started moving, and they were freed from their contract with Virgin, and they were able to then carry on recording on their own record label for another few years. But XTC's history is a rich and interesting one, and it's actually good to see that in more recent times their music and their contribution to British music has started to be recognised even more, and they are seen as individuals and very unique in the music landscape in this country. And finally, probably the most famous artist and albums to be associated with Chipping Norton in many ways were recorded by Gerry Rafferty. In particular, the first of 3 that he recorded here in 1978, called City to City, which has the legendary Baker Street. Now, this particular album and that single were all recorded here, and it also led to a follow-up in 1979 called Night Owl, which was again recorded entirely at Chipping Norton. And after that, in 1980, a third album called Snakes and Ladders was also recorded here. It became a second home for Gerry, and he really did grow to like the place quite a lot. In particular, so I've read, he also grew to love the fish and chips from the local fish and chip shops that was literally several doors away from the studio. So it was a regular event to be ordering fish and chips all round for the band and the road crew and everybody else that was there in the studio at the time. So who would have thought, looking at this building, that it was a place where lots of world-famous records were actually recorded? These days, it is still a studio, but of a very different kind. If you want to get your dentures fixed, or you've got a problem with your teeth, then it's the place to go, because it is now a dental studio. There is a blue plaque outside to commemorate its past, but the studio did finally close down in 1999 due to a lack of work, essentially. And just to prove the point about the chip shop, it's still there. It's a few doors up the hill, and there it is, still serving those fish and chips to this day. So it's amazing to think that an old converted school building like this, which became a 15-room hotel in effect for musicians and a recording studio, would produce so much famous music. You would never know from looking at it from the outside. Now, one final shot as we leave Chipping Norton is just looking down on the town from the hills outside, and you can actually see how hilly it is, and those houses and buildings perched on the side there. There are some pretty steep hills if you drive in and around all the houses and so on that sort of cling to the top of that hill and down its slopes. So thank you for watching this video, and if ever you get the chance to pop into Chipping Norton as you're passing and maybe go and take a look at that studio on New Street, you'll see a blue plaque above the door if you do. If you could please do all the usual things such as like, comment and subscribe, and we'll look forward to the next video and hopefully see you there.